The next thing we're going to be looking at is the international business cycle and the regional business cycles. So this is a little bit of a shorter bit than globalization was in the global economy. But your international business cycle is essentially the fluctuations in global economic growth. So it's pretty much measuring and tracking how does GWP increase and decrease, why is it increasing and decreasing, how can we help stabilize it, things like that. Generally, the global economy tends to experience recessions and booms at the same time. So essentially what that means is that typically countries tend to experience the same things at the same time. Of course, it's not exactly in sync and it's not always to the same degree, but it's rare for, say, America to be experiencing a really big boom and, say, the EU is now in recession. So typically things do tend to sort of line up between economies. So a boom or a peak, so that's the highest point or like a relatively high point in GWP, is when investment and consumption worldwide is high. People are spending a lot of money, there's a lot of imports and exports going between economies. Employment is high due to high economic growth, and your interest rates also tend to increase to combat inflation. With interest rates and inflation, don't stress yourself too much about that now. In topic 3, you do a whole thing, and topic 4 about inflation and interest rates. So don't stress if you don't understand why that happens just yet. So we've also got downsizing. So downsizing is when there's falling demand and output as a result of rising rates of unemployment. And an example of this is the onset of the GFC 2007 and 8, and how that impacted the European sovereign debt crisis in 2011 and 2012. So downsizing results in troughs or recessions in the international business cycle, and a trough, for example, in a regional business cycle can then translate into a trough in the international business cycle as well. So then, of course, we've got the impact of COVID on the IBC. I'm telling you, COVID will come up with like every single thing you do this year, so get used to it. Start loving COVID, I guess, in relation to economics, not in general. But yeah, pretty much a reduction of trade and investment has led to a downsizing in the international business cycle, fairly self-explanatory. Something else interesting to consider is Brexit. So a lot of people predicted that Brexit will result in the reduction of the EU's overall GDP. Will be really interesting to look at and to find the actual statistics about how Brexit changed the EU's GDP, and then how that change in the EU then impacted the international business cycle as well. So some key factors to consider with changing international business cycles and regional business cycles. So first of all, changes in trade flows. Low demand means there's low trade, decreases economic growth, and on the converse, high demand, high trade, high economic growth. Okay, so that's one of the big factors that changes level of activity in the international or regional business cycles. You've also got investment, so big economic events will decrease investment because people have less discretionary income, such as in the GFC. You've also got interest rates. So typically looking at interest rates, they are influenced by one another, so there is political influences. So for example, if the USA interest rates are low, other countries typically tend to do the same thing as the US. High interest rates dampen economic activity, low interest rates stimulate it. Again, don't stress too much about interest rates. You'll start looking more in depth at interest rates in topic 2, and then you do a lot of them in 3 and 4. So don't stress if you're confused about interest rates right now. And then also just looking at financial markets and like overseas confidence. So Australia's share prices typically reflect the USA, so typically they're high. But the more confident people are in the economy, the more likely they are to invest. More investment means more demand, more trade, more economic growth, and leads to peaks in international and regional business cycles as well. So your regional business cycle then, fairly self-explanatory, but just as a definition, are the fluctuations in the level of economic activity, such as output, trade, and financial flows in a geographic region of the global economy over time. So, for example, the sovereign debt crisis in Greece impacted the world, but more specifically, geographically impacted the EU area. So that includes 27 countries in Europe that are part of the EU, and then those three largest economies are the UK, Germany, and France, which are all also relatively really big economies in the world. So typically, changes in the regional business cycles of the EU area do tend to translate to changes in the international business cycles. So they are really linked together, those two. So some regions to consider if you want to talk about regional business cycles is North America. So how changes in the US will have more of a direct impact on Canada and Mexico first, before they then impact the rest of the world. The East Asian region as well, dominated by Japan and China. And alongside that, it's important to note that Australia are more integrated with East Asiana region. We're not completely integrated in the East Asia region, but we're more integrated with them. Hence, recessions in Europe and the US don't tend to affect Australia as much. Like Australia, don't get me wrong, is very impacted by them still, but just not as much as, say, Canada is going to be impacted by a change in the USA. Australian exports also are now more dependent on the Chinese business cycle and demand in China as well, because of how much we export to China as well. And just as like a general fun fact, Australia is one of the only countries that export more to China than we import from them, like relative to like population and stuff like that, which is just like a random fun fact for you.